Okay. So back to our sheet here. Take this out. Okay. Which talks about here. Yeah. Okay. Human nature adequately understood, okay. We're body, soul, composites. And that original sin of Adam, just if you can remember, what were the effects of the original sin that were bequeathed to all of us? What were some of them? What were some of them? Anyone? What?
Pain in childbirth.
Pain in general. In childbirth too. Okay? Childbirth was supposed to be a joyful experience. God tells Eve, you will experience pain in childbirth. And I'm told that that's a very painful experience to grow to a child. I will never have that experience. They say women have a higher tolerance for pain, that men could never stand that pain in childbirth. Okay? Women can do it.
Wait a second.
And yes.
Isn't it like a woman giving birth like the same as like a guy passing a kidney stone or something like that?
Oh, I think it's worse. I've heard it's worse. Yeah, I know people who have passed kidney stones, and I'm told. In fact, I know some women who have passed kidney stones, and they say childbirth is pretty painful. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So, but then there's joy that comes afterwards. Okay? So, they bequeathed to us. Okay? What was the greatest thing that was lost, though? The most important thing of all that Adam and Eve lost, above anything else, that they as a result we suffer what? Our what? Sanctifying grace, our share in God's life. That's it. That was the key to get to heaven. Okay? And they lost that. So that's why Jesus had to come and redeem us, and by baptism we come into God's life. Okay? But also we have, as a result of that original sin, we have bequeathed to us, our intellect is darkened. We don't see things as clearly as we should. Our free will is weakened. Okay? St. Paul says, I don't do the good that I know I should do, and I do the evil that I know I shouldn't do. And we experience this. Yeah, we sin, in other words. Okay? If anyone says they don't sin, they're not in touch with reality. We all sin in ways. Okay? And so our intellect is darkened, our free will is weakened, we experience pain, we experience suffering, and death. We're all going to die. That's for sure. Okay? And that inclination to sin that I spoke of, and what is that called again? What's the inclination to sin? What is it called? It's a big long word. It is what? Robert, what? You remember? Inclination to sin? What is it? Concupiscence. Say that with me, okay? Concupiscence, okay? That's what's written on here, okay? The inclination to sin, concupiscence, and it's manifested in 7 ways. Okay? That's the 7 capital sins or the 7 deadly sins. These are ways we're inclined to sin. Now, let me just read from the book of Genesis, okay? The account of what happens after Eve sins. Okay? I already mentioned, Adam and Eve, before they sinned, were naked and they felt no shame because they could look at each other, see the beauties of the other person's body, and not want to desire it for selfish purposes. We can't do that now. Okay? And Adam and Eve, once they sinned, they realized they were experiencing lusts, okay? Wanting to use the other person, so they sewed loincloths over themselves to cover themselves. Okay? And but I'm going to read something else here that's revealing to us about fallen human nature. Okay? when, after Adam and Eve sinned, okay, they hid themselves, and God says, why were you hiding? And Adam says, well, I realized I was naked. Who told you you were naked? The man replied, God says to him, you have eaten then of the tree that I had forbidden you to eat. And what does the man say? Very telling. He says, the woman whom you put here with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, so I ate it. So what's Adam doing when God's questioning him? Oh, you realize you're naked. Okay. So, in other words, you've sinned. Why did you do this? And what does Adam say? Instead of saying, Lord, I'm sorry, I know I did wrong, please forgive me. And some theologians, it's kind of speculation, God maybe would have forgiven that original sin of Adam if he would have been sorry. But he wasn't sorry. What did he do? When confronted with his sin, he blamed Eve. That woman you put here with me, Lord. It's her fault. You know? She gave me the fruit. And then we see the same type of thing in Eve, okay? Because the Lord then asked the woman, why did you do such a thing? And the woman answers, what? What did Eve say? She blamed someone else. She blamed the serpent made me do it. The serpent made me do it. Well, the serpent, the devil, didn't make her do it. They had free will. They freely chose. They succumbed to this temptation. And then we see God saying, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers, Satan. He will strike at your head while you strike at his heel. That enmity between Satan, the total hatred between Satan and the seed of the woman. The woman is Mary, and the woman herself. There's going to be hatred and opposition. And he or she will crush your head. Actually, the Hebrew is a third person neuter pronoun. It will crush your head. Jesus actually crushes the head of the serpent by dying on the cross, but Mary does too by cooperating. That's why, have you seen Mary with standing over the earth with her foot over the head of the serpent? That's the fulfillment of this prophecy in Genesis 3:15. It's the first prophecy of the Savior. God promises a Savior who will crush the head of the serpent. And then, to the woman, God says, I will intensify the pangs of your childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your urge shall be for your husband, and yet he will be your master. Well, this is not a good relationship, master-slave relationship, but that's the power thing that was evident in our fallen nature. That because the man is physically more powerful than the woman, he can treat her badly. Oh no, God doesn't want this. This is an effect of original sin. And then, to the man, God says, cursed be the ground because of you, in toil you shall eat its yield all the days of your life. He's telling us here that work would now be a toil. It wasn't supposed to be a toil. Work would have been a joy for people. Adam and Eve were supposed to work in the Garden of Paradise. But now, because they've been cast out of the garden, work is a toil. Work is tedious. That's why at the beginning of the day it's good to offer up all our works, especially the work that's tedious. That's difficult. That's a pain in the neck that we don't want to do. The worst subject that you don't like, offer it up. That's what we do with the morning offering. That's why it's such a good prayer to say every day. Okay. So, those 7 deadly sins are ways that they're doorways to sins, and I'm going to give an example, a real life example of how the deadly sins are the doorways to other sins. Now, you've heard of King David, right? Okay. King David. There's a famous story with King David. He's up on the roof of his palace after he's defeated all his enemies, okay? Almost all of them. His army's fighting like one some Canaanites or something, but he's not too worried about that. He's not out fighting himself. He was the great general. So he's up on his palace, kind of just lounging around and walking around, nothing to do. And he notices in the river down the way a woman who is bathing. And he looks and she's bathing unrobed. And David begins to desire her, and he inquires about her. And does anyone know who this woman is? What her name is? She's very famous. No? Her name is Bathsheba. And David sees this woman, inquires about her. His men come and say, well, this is Bathsheba. She's the husband of Uriah, the Hittite, who is one of your soldiers. And David says, well, tell her to come to me. David has relations with her. So kings were like the rock stars of their day. Right? So David was a good-looking guy. And David and Bathsheba have relations. This is called adultery. And then Bathsheba, she communicates to David, David, guess what? I'm with child. And David says, ooh, this isn't good, okay? So he knows Uriah, her husband, is out in the battlefield, okay? So he calls in Uriah to talk to him. And he says, oh, how are things going out there on the battlefield? Uriah tells him, he says, listen, he gives him some advice. He says, why don't you go down and spend the night with your wife, okay? Now, you've been out in the battlefield for a long time. Just spend the night with your wife. Why does he want him to spend the night with his wife? Because so he can have relations with her, and then when the child comes along, he'll think it's his child. Okay? Well, Uriah doesn't do that. Uriah sleeps outside the palace gate, and David sees him the next day and says, well, didn't you go down to your wife? He says, well, no. How can I go out and be sleeping with my wife when I know my soldiers are out in the battlefield? I have to return there. And David says, well, come on, just have dinner with me. David gets him drunk, loads him with wine and good food, and says, now, go with your wife. Okay, tonight, Uriah still doesn't do it. He still sleeps outside the gate. He's a faithful soldier, okay? So, what does David do? David writes, you know the story? What does David do?
He goes in the general or whatever.
He writes a note to the general.
Put him on the front line.
Put him on the front lines and
So he would die.
and then pull back to let him die. And he gives the actual note to Uriah to carry, but he steals it, so Uriah won't open it. So Uriah gives it to the general. He's put up at the front lines, killed. And then David calls Bathsheba. Okay, come on. Well, that's not the end of the story. I'll just pause right here before I say the end of the story. Because now we're dealing with capital sins here that led to other sins. They open the door to sins. Okay? First thing David's doing, he's up on top of the palace. Nothing to do, just looking around. What capital sin is that? What do you think? Sloth. Okay? He's being lazy. He's not doing work. He's not being industrious. He's not being busy. Idleness is the devil's workshop, as they say. This is what happens. Then he begins to look at another woman, a married woman, in a bad way. That's lust. Okay? So sloth leads to lust, and lust leads to what? What sins? What sins does lust lead to? A couple of sins. Big bad ones, okay? One is adultery, and then, even worse, he has Uriah killed, murder. Okay? He's an adulterer and he's a murderer. He's responsible for Uriah's murder. He wanted him dead. Well, that's not the end of the story, as I say, because God sends the prophet Nathan to David. And this is a real lesson in human psychology. And he says, go to my servant David and say this to him. He does. He says to David, I'm going to tell you a story, my king. David says, okay. there was a man who, a poor man, he had one ewe lamb, one little lamb that he cared for, he loved it, and it was his favorite pet. Okay? And his neighbor, who was a very rich man, he had flocks galore, but he wanted the one ewe lamb that his neighbor had, wanted to take it from him. And so he takes it from him, leaving him nothing. What do you think of that story? And David says, well, that rich man who did this should suffer, okay, and pay back what he took from this poor man. And Nathan shakes his head and says, David, you are the man. You are the man. Those were his words. What does he mean by that? David did the same thing. David, by the way, had many wives. The kings back in ancient Israel had wives galore, and concubines. Those who were not wives, but they gave them sexual pleasure. This was something that was done. If you were the king, you did this. So David had all these women, and yet he goes and takes the wife of...
The following students please report to the main office at the bell. Jimmy O'Lear, Maddie Scott, Lynn Ron Shee, Michael Singleton, Dustin White, Adam McCabe.